Chris mentioned that Oxford sometimes a bit of late arriving. I remember one time my youth, I was a debater, and we got this debating topic, which was that the church always arrives a little late and a little breathless. And I was to oppose the motion, and we won the motion by arguing that the church never arrives. So, and I would like to, I'm conscious this evening that we have a mixed audience, and the topic I've chosen is a little generic. You choose a title way out, keeping it as broad as possible. But what I would like to do is slightly, just for the first half an hour, is give you an overview of some of the issues that I think will shape how we need to look at the future, particularly of the ethical challenges. But they have to be seen in a broader context. I would also in that maybe just talk about how the church has got involved in and an interest in this area, why it should have an interest in this area. And as I say, I have a PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is as much to reassure you I'm not making it up as I go along, and also to keep me on track. So I will speak for about half an hour, then Helen and Eric will join me, which will focus the conversation a little bit more, and then we're open also to questions, if that's as a format. I'd like to begin by talking first about, I think, the context and the content of what I want to talk about. There's been a huge amount of attention globally to what is called the digital disruption, the digital revolution, whatever term people want to talk about it. In a sense, I suppose like most people, I discovered that through technology. I realized that the technology I was handling was becoming more powerful, was becoming smaller, was becoming cheaper, was becoming more connected, so I had a kind of an interest in this technology. Working in the church area of communications, then our first interest began to be, because we're in the business of communications, thinking about how the changes in communications brought about by digital technology would be a challenge for the church. So one of the things learning and trying to learn still is that while at one level it looks great, we can get everything we want up there online and broadcast all we want, the more difficult part is finding an audience and finding a conversation, or starting a conversation. So we're trying to learn in terms of how we move into the area of social media, how we develop a style of communications that is more interactive, that is more listening, that allows for conversations to happen rather than just us to have another microphone that we can use. But then, more than just that, we began to say, look, the changes are in the technology. The technologies are changing how we communicate, how the world communicates. In a sense, then, it's a cultural revolution. It's changing the patterns of communication. Three different ways we can think about that. One is, it potentially gives everybody a voice, which was different to the past. We were consumers of media. Now we can, as individuals, be both consumers of media and protagonists. We can, even by as simply as what we share, we are becoming producers of media. We are helping to the share of that information. And that, I think, has changed many things. What I want to begin to say is that internet technology, the developments that are coming, will create specific new issues that we have to discuss, that as human beings, we have to think about and reflect about to ensure that these technologies will somehow be of service and benefit to our human communities. But also they have radically changed, and this is perhaps the more disturbing issue, the conversations we have to have are going to happen in a context that has already been changed by social media. So the environment in which we have to begin to discuss, to try and find points of agreement, find principles that will guide us, find consensus as to what is the best way forward, that environment itself has, and I'll come back to that in a moment when I look at some of the cultural context, we recognize that it's more difficult in some ways to have conversations, because one of the kind of sad effects of the social media revolution has been to lead to an increased polarization. I'll hit that in more detail. The church also, very often the church, when we think about things, we're inclined a little bit to think of ourselves on the outside looking in, discerning. But the church itself is being changed and will be changed by social media. Our core activities are around forming community. We're concerned in how people form their identity, how they get their sense of themselves, how they relate to each other. And they are activities that are radically changed. I have my own, I've said this many times, but my own focus group and my 15 nephews and nieces aged 10 to 32 who have grown up in a radically different world to the world I grew up in. Because they have ways of being informed, they have ways of forming opinion, they have ways of forming community, they have ways of forming friendship that are radically, radically different. They are more informed in some ways than I ever was. They also have this power to voice. They can say what they want to say. Our time, you might have written to, I didn't, but some people did write to the editor. They were generally perceived to be cranks and were screened out, but is now a position where people have the potential of having voice. One of the things for the church we also said is we're going to have to learn from some of the values and some of what is effective communication. Another thing is we need to appreciate that this is one because we are by and large, at least in Rome at our end of it, where, I still count as young, so that's kind of worrying. So one of the things is convincing people that this is real, that the digital is real. It's not something separate or different or somehow less real than what's happening. It augments, it helps to create the existential environment in which young people in particular, but not just young people, are living. It's how they interact and engage with the world. The social media part of the piece, again, just to background on this one, is for a church one, is probably never having had, in the classic Vatican tradition, you're appointed to a job for which you were never trained. So I was put into communications, never having studied communications. But you quickly learn, can we communicate to exchange information, but also to form and develop relationships? Social media has brought those much closer together. So a lot of our key information we get them in and through the people we choose to associate with. That we sometimes choose who we will associate with on the basis of the type of information we judge them to be providing. So this again has been a dynamic. It also means for the church in that context, we have to be much more in a listening mode and in an interactive. By interactive, I mean taking people's questions seriously, be willing to allow them to question us, not simply seeing their questions as an excuse for us to jump in with our ready-made answer, but to have the conversation that can lead to growth and mutual understanding. The other thing is that we found again is that what's happening in terms of digital culture, it's ongoing. One of these ideas where we worry about the future, where it's all going, but one of the perspectives I think is important to say that the future is to some extent already here. What we do now will determine, to some extent, the future. Some of you probably know the book by Mark O'Connell, To Be a Machine, which is a kind of more cultural analysis of transhumanism and the big questions about freezing your bodies and uplifting your brain onto computers. And it's a fantastic journey in which he meets all the gurus of the various forms of humanism. But his conclusion I thought was very interesting. He says, I am not now, nor have I ever been a transhumanist. I'm certain I would not want to live in their future, but I'm not always certain I don't live in their present. That some of the ideas, the thinking, is already embodying how we come to issues. Church, again, very early on, as we began to reflect on and try and develop positions and articulate positions around digital culture, social media, a deliberate choice to affirm the positive. Because I think the easy headline would be, and it's the natural head, Vatican condemns, whatever it is, no, let's affirm the positive. Let's look at the potential for good that exists in social media and keep that alive. That was partly because not wanting to be seen as kind of some sort of Luddites who are there as ever opposed to whatever is new. What's been interesting in some of the more critical reaction, particularly from younger people who have grown up in the social media milieu, who are truly digital, are therefore free to be a little bit more critical and have invited us to be more critical on the abuses. They're obvious enough, the abuse of social media one can understand, but also on some of the patterns of behavior that are associated with even regular use of social media, and invited us to think more critically about that. In terms of what I want to develop the principles, I'm going to draw, Laudato Si is a document from Pope Francis reflecting on environment, climate change, the challenges to our future. What I want to do is to use that as a point, abstract some of his thinking there and apply it to some of the issues that we need to be concerned about. And the things I want to hit there is, one is his method. He's very clear in issuing a letter about the environmental situation that he wants to highlight the urgency of the situation, and he wants to engage all people. He wants to initiate a conversation that is as inclusive as possible, because that, he says, is the only way we can, as a human community, address something that is a challenge to all of us. So the image that he has of the common home that we all share, and how are we going to, irrespective of what philosophical, religious or non-religious perspectives we come to, how are we going to look together at these issues? And that is a method, saying that we need to watch the inclusivity of our debates. He then also, if those of you, many of you will be probably more familiar than I am with the detail of Laudato Si, but he's very clear that you don't look at the environmental issue in abstraction from broader cultural issues, particularly the political and economic context in which we exist. And I think a similar thing is important as we look at digital culture, as we look at the future innovations at technology, that we be attentive and critically aware of the political and economic context in which they are happening. And then there are some pure, more principles that he enunciates, insights that he articulates, that I would like to look at, because some of them are directly relevant to what we're talking about and some of them are relevant by analogy. So as I say, that's my method in looking at these issues. The first question, and this I think is just background, is church and science, church and technology doesn't always have a glorious history. There have been tensions between the scientific community and people of faith. Many of those, in terms of the better proponents of theology and the better proponents of science, can be overcome, and a reconciliation and an understanding can emerge. But in popular culture, it's not unusual to kind of put faith, science, and technology in opposite corners. It's important to recognize that, and this is material I'm drawing on here, is coming from Laudato Si, where the same question emerges, is the sense of appreciating the gift that science and technology is. And the Pope is very clear. He says we need to appreciate and thank scientists, engineers, technicians for what they have done. He's talking about the benefits that they have brought in terms of health, in terms of engineering, sanitary conditions, economic development. We need to recognize the benefits. But another point is slightly more subtle, is to say that it's not just about the benefits, but to be creative, to build a better world, to work and make progress, is, in a sense, human creativity, reflecting in the Christian perspective the fact that we were made in the image and likeness of a God who was the creator. So therefore, creativity is something to be affirmed. Human creativity, that desire to know more, to develop more, to push, is something to be praised. Just in the parentheses here, I remember many years ago, somebody, very often these talks end up with somebody saying, well, we shouldn't play God. And I remember a theologian saying, maybe we should play God. We should think about God's image of creation, a creation done out of love, done for the benefit of others, and maybe invite people to be creative and to be innovative, but to do it with that same care and attention that we find in those idea of doing it out of love for the benefit of all. On the other side, I think one of the things that does emerge, we have to is admit that there can be sometimes in the technical scientific community, or maybe in the more popular exponents of those arguments, sometimes an over-optimism. I think of Eric Smith's great one, that all we really need to do to resolve, I'm being unfair to him here, but he has this very strong statement about where he says, the best thing anyone can do to improve the quality of life around the world is to drive connectivity and technical opportunity. When given the access, the people will do the rest. That's 4 or 5 years ago. It's probably not something he might say today, as we recognize that somehow, sometimes there can be also even a solution that somehow technology will fix all the problems. So even on the environmental issue, we will find technical solutions. And behind it is kind of a vision somehow about the expanding human spirit that somehow everything will be okay and scientists will save us. I think the contribution of scientists, technicians and engineers will be hugely important for all our global problems, but I think we need to turn it down a little bit. One of the insights around that, and these are some of the responses to that from we need to recover and insist very much on the importance of human agency, on the human choices. Pope Benedict articulated that very strongly, where he says, you know, that all the interconnection and dissemination of ideas will not of itself promote freedom or internationalize development and democracy for all. To achieve goals of this kind, they need to focus on promoting the dignity of persons and peoples. They need to be clearly inspired by charity and placed at the service of truth and of the good. That there's a require for human agency. We need to recognize human responsibility in terms of the area of technical innovation. One way, and there's I think a little development in the Pope Francis's thought here. Traditionally, one way we expressed that in the church and was the technology is neutral. You can use it for good, you can use it for bad, it can be abused or it can be used properly. The fact that it can be abused doesn't take away its valid use. There's another analysis that is in Pope Francis when he talks about what he calls the technocratic paradigm, where he says that technology leads us to think about the world and reflect about the world in a particular way. And he makes a couple of points about that. The first one he says is that it can be said that many problems of today's world stem from the tendency, at times unconscious, to make the method and aims of science and technology an epistemological paradigm which shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. The effects of imposing this model on reality as a whole, human and social, are seen in the deterioration of the environment, but this is just one sign of reductionism which affects every aspect of human and social life. That to think that science alone can help us to understand our world and to make its methods the only methods he wants to question. One effect of that he mentions in particular is science and technology can work sometimes with the presupposition that somehow I'm not the outsider acting on something that's outside of me. Whereas in the environmental issue we're learning, we live within ecosystems where what we do affects ourselves. That is equally, I think, true as we look at the technologies. We are part of a cosmos and we're acting in that cosmos. We're not standing out separate from it. The other thing I think is that Pope Francis brings quite strongly is he wants to insist on the richness of diverse traditions, of different forms of wisdom, including religious wisdom, not in any sense denying the importance of scientific and technological thinking. The types of wisdoms coming from societies that have a different perspective and way of understanding more holistically perhaps our world, that we need to have that inclusivity for thinking, and that sometimes the danger is that the technical is there and we don't think about other approaches. One of the things then that I think on the technology thing, and this is where I talk about the political and economic, is that one of the things we see to some extent already is the increase of inequality that is coming about as less and less people are developing greater and greater platforms and greater companies that have more and more influence. And we're getting obvious increase in some of the differences in wealth between those who have become very wealthy and those who may be middle class squeezed because certain types of jobs may disappear. But that's also, I think, not just about, it's also about the level of influence. Politics, particularly where large companies can shop for jurisdictions, the capacity of politics to respond effectively to what's happening can be limited. The capacity particularly then of the speed of change is so quick that it's hard for us to catch up. And the international organization has been challenged. So I think question about governance, where it's happening. Somewhat unfair but interesting thing recently, some of you may have seen a long read in The Guardian, was by a guy called Corey Payne, who was looking at the culture of Silicon Valley and the startup, and his conclusion is overly stated, but he said, many of the people in that world have a sense of destiny. We are the elite, we're on our way, we're not just wealthier, but we are better. And he concludes it all with a rather overstated but humorous piece where he says, look, basically they're the same as ever. What they want to do is to take all the money and run. And then he concludes, to Mars if necessary. And if you think about, the buying of the places in New Zealand and the buying of the farms and the looking at how we can create, it's not always an inclusive vision of where the future is going. And I'm not saying many are directly attributing that or owning it or explicitly, but it can be an influence and a way of thinking. The cultural issue. As I say, one of the things from the beginning, in terms of the cultural impact of the new technologies, one thing was to say the potential is extraordinary for creating access to knowledge, for bringing closeness between people, and promoting ultimately the potential is there for a dialogue, or as sometimes in terms of our Catholic theology we would talk about, to recover a sense of the unity and oneness of the human family. That potential is there. The reality, the sad reality we know, is that to some extent what we are seeing is increased polarization. We have seen the development of fake news. Fake news, in a sense, working because people want to hear a certain type of news. They're not interested in learning something different. They are polarized. They're looking for the echo chamber that will reassure them of the correctness of their own position. I think in this context, we need to be very careful as to how, and this is the thing where I say, there are debates we have to have in society that are urgent. And maybe what's happening is that fake news and the polarization is undermining the trust that is necessary for proper public discourse, particularly on a global level, to happen. And I think Honora O'Neill's Tighe Lecture 2002 is not only right, but extraordinarily prophetic, when she said, if the media mislead or if readers cannot assess their reporting, the wells of public discourse and public life are poisoned. The new information technologies may be anti-authoritarian, but curiously they are often used in ways that are also anti-democratic. They undermine our capacity to judge the other's claims and to place our trust. I think that's a crisis. Pope Francis is not one who usually goes down that more gloomy, but in Laudato Si, there's a very strong analysis of what he calls a crisis within society. And he names the crisis, which he says is ethical, cultural, and spiritual crisis of modernity. And he talks about its effect somehow that postmodernism, which another theologian, Hank Witte, has said very clearly, it's not that postmodernism is new, it's been around for a while, but that digital technology has somehow served as a catalyst that has maybe spread and sped up the dissemination of postmodern. So we don't have an agreed vision of the world. We don't have a story that unites us. We don't have the bigger things that help us to feel as one. Or as he said it, we don't have a shared view of the past, a shared hope for the future, and we tend to be more the preference for experience and emotion over reason and logic. Some of that being part of the legacy of not postmodernism maybe in its pure or thought true form, but in its sense as a cultural phenomenon. And Pope Francis does a great listing of the isms that follow that. But where he says, if you try and make sense of what's happening in our world, what's driving our world, what's the mentality that explains what's happening, he says, what we begin to see is the increase of individualism, notions of unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, the unregulated market. And he has this idea that unless we address questions about how we think about our world and the bigger questions, we're not going to recover the capacity to have a general conversation. He is critical of what he calls utilitarianism. I don't think it's pure utilitarianism, not the utilitarians that any philosopher would espouse, but it's a diffused version or a disseminated or a trickled down version of utilitarian thinking that is in society. And very often people have assimilated that without assimilating it consciously, and therefore without being aware of the critical views that would give a more rounded understanding of the philosophy they work with. And I think utilitarianism as a kind of an approach that we measure our consequences, what are the good, what are the bad, we put them in contrast with each other in whatever form, can look quite scientific and will appeal to a scientific mind as kind of a reasonable and fair and objectively quick way of doing things. Difficulties I think that we have to acknowledge is not all consequences are predictable. We don't know what the consequences will be. And the other one is we can't always measure values that are different. How do we put them into dialogue with each other? And with maybe sometimes what's happening is in the absence of being able to measure or put values, we put undue emphasis on what we can measure. So speed, velocity, profits, and results. And it becomes almost like a self-serving, a vicious circle of some sense. Add to that commercial determinism, which is a kind of an idea that a lot of what's happening is not just happening abstractly. It's been driven by a desire by companies. Much research has moved out of the university or has gone into the university, blended with the research, with the commercial companies that have to deliver. And sometimes the short-term thinking that is a feature of our economies may not create the kind of environment in which we think enough about what we're doing. There was a novel I came across recently, which is very clear. It was about people working on cloning. And there was one group of people having an ethical decision. Then there were the people doing the work who were wondering about the bonus they would get if they were the first to effectively deliver this technology. I think we need to watch and come back to is this thing is Lord Skidelsky, a little quote at a Vatican conference last year where he said, "The problem is that we lack the public language for discussing alternative pathways to the future. We rely on morality to judge the ethical value of current economic arrangements, but no system of secular ethics has emerged capable of making unambiguous judgments concerning either the morality of motives or the justice of distribution. In fact, the reverse. Ethics followed the path of economics into subjectivity. The rational, self-seeking individual became the best judge of both his or her economic and his or her moral good." So he's saying we need to think about where we give something that breaks the subjective. The social aspects here. Sorry. One of the things I think it's a beginning is, I said we need dialogue if we are going to have a truly responsible human response to emerging technologies. We recognize that dialogue has become more difficult. Again, an issue that Pope Francis, to some extent, I'd say, hammers home continually is that dialogue begins with an attitude, which fundamentally is about how do I perceive and understand the other person? Is the other person a threat, a competition, an enemy? Or do I see the other, the person who's different, who has a different perspective to life, as somebody who, like me, is human, has value, has worth, and in fact I can learn from? So before we look at the issue of dialogue or how you do dialogue, it must begin with an acceptance that I can learn from the other. In fact, dialogue will be enriching. At the same time, we recognize that the identity is hugely affected by social media. I think there was a British government study a few years ago that suggests that social media usage was actually more determinative than identity than issues such as race and gender and political views. It was quite an interesting study by the Foresight people, which was interesting. But in that context, one thing that can happen, I think, is a sense of almost like the social media made me do it. The environment is negative. I go in, and I think we need to recover as a sense of insisting on the importance of discovering of human agency. We talk sometimes about the consumer-generated content, but we think it needs more of a consumer-generated culture. How we prevent, so this has been a key one for the church. One tendency said in church, tell believers to stay out of social media. It'll contaminate them. It's rough, it's awful, it's horrible. You're only giving credence to the worst. Another view, which I think is about, as I once says to people, stay there, be part of it. Don't abandon the field to the trolls or to the negatives, but don't be determined by it. So it's almost like the old, be in the world, but not of the world. How do we keep this sense of, and a commitment to trying to humanize the conversations, which is, as I say, begins with an attitude. I think we could articulate values. And the values, I think, simply if we take social media not as descriptive but as prescriptive. What will make the media social in the truly meaningful sense that it builds society and builds community? It'll be if we can highlight the importance of respecting the other in our discourse, honesty in the way we present our views, an ability to reason, and a commitment to inclusivity, not just wanting the views that already agree with me. So we try and make of social media a commitment rather than just a descriptive. I think for the church, and again, I'm going to move quickly here because my time is nearly up, but I want to hit, one of our biggest commitments as a church is in the world of education. I think the digital revolution requires us to have a very radical rethink of what we do in educational institutes, how we teach people issues about not just they can access the information. We're no longer the gatekeepers. We have to be the guides and the mentors and those who accompany, those of us who are in a teaching role, who will also be taught by another generation. So we need also to think about pedagogical methods that are also more networked and more collaborative in their way. We also then, I think, need to recognize, and an American archbishop put this very well, he says, look, social media thrives on visual, fast, emotional, impactful. He says reflection requires time, silence, logic. So how do we teach people those values? And that becomes important, I think, too, in a context where people are maybe talking more and more about fake news, and that the response to fake news will be for the social media companies to create algorithms that will screen out the fake news. But whose view will prevail there? And I think we have to think much more about enabling people to be able to discern, to make judgment, to reason. And I think that goes right back to how we educate. I'll skip the next two. They're more in-house church-related things, and I'm happy to take questions later on. How the non-authoritative environment of the internet is a challenge for the church, and also how it means we have to rethink our own forms of being church. The ethical, and this is moving very quickly now, to one of the things that as it was said, I spent many years as a teacher of moral theology, and I was always struck by an observation by the Irish novelist Brian Moore, who began one of his novels, which was about the Catholic Church. And he said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no. and I have to say, it very accurately, I'm afraid, captured many of my students when I was teaching. You could see they were waiting for me to come in with my no. And one of the things I always committed was frame the no as part of the yes. No matter what issue you're talking about, it's about a yes to life and the goodness of life and the importance of life. So how do we frame the no as a response to protection, the value and the good of life? If we go straight to norms and rules, I think we've missed. Norms and rules come at the end of a values and come ultimately from a vision and understanding. And Pope Francis talking about the environmental issue, but I think equally it applies absolutely here. He said, when we go deep with the ethical issues, and he said, when we ask ourselves what kind of world we want to leave behind, we think in the first place of its general direction, its meaning and its values. Unless we struggle with these deeper issues, I do not believe that our concern for ecology, for ethics, will produce significant results. But if these issues are courageously faced, we are led inexorably to ask other pointed questions. What is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of all our work and all our efforts? What need does the world have of us? I think we need to get back to those deeper conversations, which in a world of doing and practice and delivery, we can be worried about them. I think another reason is Pope Francis has highlighted a thing. He says that if we don't have deeper values and deeper commitments, we end up with a type of de facto relativism. And no laws or no rules will in fact stop us doing what we want to do ourselves. We'll game them, or we'll play them, or we'll work around them, unless there's some commitment at a deeper level to the values that are embodied, that the rules seek to embody. Therefore, I want to just finish by saying that I think for the ethical side, I think, is how can we get back to a more objective model of thinking about and reflecting on ethics? I think traditionally and appropriately we would ask, what is the real meaning of progress? What is the good life? What are the values that help societies and individuals to flourish? And they're questions that are grounded in our tradition. They were very often embodied in a natural law, but a methodology which said by reflecting on what it is to be human, on the experiences that make life worthwhile, not just for me but for others, we can begin to argue and have a starting point to reflect on future questions in a way that should be accessible to all. Because if we're to do this well, the experience of what it is to be human is not just a Western perspective. It's not just the perspective of maybe in previous times theologians whose abstract conception of life was a little away from their own, but is actually calling for a more appreciation that we need a greater, but we do need that conversation about what's it all about and where is it going. One of the ways, and this is, as in a lot of people from, be it from the fields of biology or from neuroscience, will question the notion of nature. Is there a given nature? We are much more critically aware of the influence of genetics, of neuroscience on what we think of as ourselves. But I think an interesting point is, if one looks at the actual drivers of social media, what has made the platforms successful? Very often it's been their capacity to connect into, to identify some basic human needs. The desire for connectivity, the desire for some form of knowledge. I won't name, but we think the platforms are there. The desire sometimes for guidance. The actual desire to share, which drives so much of people's interaction. People still have that desire to share. The desire to play, to discover beauty. The desire sometimes to establish mechanisms that will establish trust. I don't really understand blockchain, but I see it as something, as people looking for some way of being able to establish consensus and trust that is more democratically done. And those drivers, those human instincts, are very close to a lot of the human goods that traditionally we used to try and ground a reflection on ethics. And maybe that's where we can go. Then the particular insights, I think, from our tradition, and we can flesh this out in conversation in a moment, would be, I think we've struggled to understand what it is to be human in terms of mind, body, body, soul, dualism. I think many of the categories of the transhumanists are making similar mistakes. The brain is the real me, the rest is just some sort of an instrument I use for getting around. And bodiliness is something that I think we need to be able to reflect on, and I think our tradition can help us on that. I think the fact that as human beings we're not just individuals, but we are social. It's in our nature to be social, and we can't live as individuals. Needs to be, from our Catholic social teaching, we'll have much, our reflection on the value of work not just as a giver of economic means, but as a place where I find my socialization, where I find express my creativity, important. But the most radical one, I think, is something as a Christian tradition which wants to insist on gratuity, on, and this is explicitly religious, on the fact that a God loves us unconditionally. We don't have to prove it, we don't have to merit it, we don't have to earn it, we don't have to demonstrate, we don't have to win to be of worth and of value. I think is perhaps maybe the most disruptive thing, if we can carry the language back to another community, that we need to break this sense of all our being our achievement. And then finally, I think just the idea of how do we recover a sense of solidarity, I think not through the head, but through bringing people to an experience of living and discovering others, learning about them, forming habits that will form their character. Okay, thank you very much.